Well, okay, we're ready to move on to chapter 4 here as we start talking about consciousness. And we're going to touch a little bit on some of the philosophical issues of consciousness that we had covered before in chapter 1. But we're going to try to move on to that and get into a little bit more of looking at some neuroscience stuff related to levels of consciousness and sleep and stuff like that too. Okay, so as a revisit from some of the chapter 1 stuff, when we start talking about consciousness, things get kind of philosophical pretty quickly. And we have raised the question of, are we really even interested in consciousness? Are we studying consciousness? Is that what we're trying to do here? Well, if we think back to chapter 1, we saw that some of the very earliest studies in psychology and some of the earliest kind of schools of thought were definitely interested in that. But one of the things that we encountered was the fact that it was just not very scientific, right? So when we talked about things like, phenomenology and structuralism, the idea was that they wanted to understand the nature of experience, right? These were what we called experience-driven approaches. The real goal was to understand what it means to have an experience. And this is where we start talking about what is experience anyway, right? We talked about qualia, right? The idea that color, for example, is a property of psychological experience, even though it's not a property of objects or of light. And so then questions come up such as, well, why is it that red appears the way it does? And why do we have qualia? And we don't really even have a good scientific explanation for that. Though what might be more interesting is to wonder whether or not there could be something in the brain that could explain this, right? Could we adopt more of a physiological explanation and say that there's something happening with neurons that creates experience? And we have now encountered neurons in the previous chapter, but we didn't really relate the question, right? Is there a relationship between what the brain is doing at a physiological level? Think about all these 85 to 100 billion neurons that we have in the brain. Think about all of the synapses that actually exist, right? So if we have 85 billion or so neurons in the brain, how many synapses are there? Because you should realize that the way that the brain is connected or interconnected is not one neuron connected to one neuron, which is connected to one neuron, right? Which would mean that the total number of synapses is only slightly larger than the number of neurons. But it's really any one neuron could be connected to 100 or more other neurons. And that's in terms of receiving input on its dendrites from 100 or more neurons. And then also its axons itself could be branching off to the dendrites of 100 other neurons. So the total number of synapses associated with just one neuron could number into the hundreds. So that means that the total number of synapses in the brain is hundreds of times larger, if not thousands of times larger, than the total number of neurons. And so the complexity of that network is something that is difficult to even visualize. And so we also then need to remember, and we touched on this just a little bit, that not all synapses are the same, right? Some synapses are excitatory, which means that neuron A causes neuron B, right? Neuron A is sending its axon to the dendrites of neuron B. Neuron A is causing neuron B to fire its action potential. That's an excitatory signal, right? It causes that spike of the voltage, right? So it causes the influx of sodium to raise and depolarize the neuron, right? To raise the voltage. But sometimes synapses are actually inhibitory. They actually shut down a lot of the gateways in the neuron and push the voltage down below its resting state, which actually makes it harder for that neuron to trigger an action potential. So now think about what we're going to call spreading activation, right? A spreading activation model is this idea that when we think about a network of thousands or hundreds of thousands of neurons, all interconnected with hundreds of thousands or millions of synapses, what's the pattern of activity spreading across that network? There are There are series and sequences of excitatory patterns as well as series and sequences of inhibitory patterns. And even that is oversimplifying it, because there are also metabolic patterns, right? That there are certain patterns that are traveling between neurons that are triggering growth processes in the neurons, which then changes the structure of the network itself. So not only is the network kind of exhibiting a pattern of excitation and inhibition, but the network itself is continuously changing. It's dynamic. The connections change, the connections grow, the connections increase the total number of synapses, or sometimes decrease the total number of synapses in a given network of neurons. This is called neuroplasticity, right? The metaphor here, we're using the word plastic to describe something that's bendable and flexible, right? As a metaphor. And so the idea of neuroplasticity is that the brain is in fact flexible in that sense, that it's dynamic and always changing, and the synapses are changing. And the network connectivity of the brain is changing constantly. As we acquire new information, our ability to learn and remember anything that happens moment to moment over the course of our lives is only possible because we have neuroplasticity, right? Because the brain's ability to change. And this is something that we know is significantly true in early childhood, when children are like sponges and acquiring new information and learning words. They learn like 1,000 words between their first and second birthday, right? So there's a massive amount of absorbing of information there. But we continue to learn and acquire new stuff for our entire lives. And so that neuroplasticity does in fact persist for our entire lives. Even if it could slow down some, nevertheless, we keep this up our entire lives. And so we could go back to this question of saying, well, so is there something happening in this network of neurons that creates consciousness? There's something special about neural activity that seems to create experiences of red and blue and green, as well as other sensory experiences like the pitch and loudness or timbre of sounds and music. And those are certainly questions that might even continue to come up as we go into the chapter after this one, which is the sensation perception chapter. But in the end, it really becomes still an unanswerable question. One philosopher who works in philosophy of mind called David Chalmers, he called it the hard problem of consciousness, right? The easy problem is to try to understand how is it that neurons and brains can store information. That's not a very easy problem, but at least it's something that we could understand how to tackle it, right? We could start studying the brain while people are engaged in a memory task. We can do EEG studies, and we can do fMRI studies to observe brain activity while people are engaged in various kinds of memory tasks. And then we might start to learn something about exactly how the brain stores information. It's difficult, but at least we know how to approach it. That's what makes it an easy problem. I would still put the scare quotes around the word easy at that point, right? But the difficult problem is to figure out how is it that the brain creates consciousness or awareness at all in the first place? What's special about neurons and neural activity that gives rise to conscious experience? And maybe even other weird ideas like free will, assuming we even have free will. That's called the hard problem because we don't even know how to begin to tackle it. We don't even know what kinds of research questions to ask to try to study it. And so, of course, in the end, this becomes more philosophy that we try to shy away from. And you don't see a lot of research on this kind of stuff in psychology. That's just a personal aside. The first time I ever went to a research conference, that's not true. Second time I ever went to a research conference as a graduate student. This would have been at the University of Toronto. So I was at Indiana University, but the conference was at the University of Toronto. And it was in 1995. And at this conference, this was a perceptual conference, researchers who study perception, which is what I was trained in and what I do. There was a session near the end of the week in the morning about consciousness. and the relationship between perception and consciousness. Because there's a few people who do it, so they put a little session in there. And I thought it seemed cool and interesting. So I went to that session, and there was like 3 people there. The entire conference, all of the hundreds of people who were in attendance at this conference, they skipped it. Not out of disrespect as much as that they just didn't care about the topic, because there is this bias amongst researchers that this is not science, right? And they picked that time because, of course, every time you go to an academic conference, you're going to at least spend some time exploring the city, having a little bit of vacation time, and that's the day they picked it, right? They're like, okay, we'll skip the consciousness session and we'll go check out Toronto. And but I went to the consciousness session, and I was like one of like 3 or 4 people who were there for those talks. So that was enlightening, right? But anyway, and there was an interesting talk that I did see, by the way, but I don't want to go further into that. But as we're seeing here, there are these difficult problems, and we're going to try to shy away from that. And again, I didn't talk about the bottom half of the slide here, problem of other minds, but we raised this back in chapter 1. So revisit that. But again, not only is it difficult to study consciousness, we could try to study it in ourselves through introspection, but that was seen as being a problem. But then how do we study it in other people? We can study their brains, right? We can put them in an MRI scanner. We could see areas of the brain light up during a task, but we're not seeing their consciousness. We're seeing their neurons, right? And the relationship between neurons and consciousness is still the mysterious thing. So don't be tempted when you see these images of MRIs and you see parts of the brain lighting up. Don't be tempted to think you're looking at people's thoughts, because you're not looking at people's thoughts, right? You're looking at their neurons and the flow of blood to their neurons supporting neural activity. That's all that you're seeing there. The relation between neurons and thinking, or neurons and consciousness, is still not at all understood. It remains part of the hard problem of consciousness. Well, I have that right here. So we assume that consciousness is a byproduct of neural activity. But is that really even true? That's the first question. Is it? Is consciousness a byproduct of neural activity? What that question is assuming or asking is that when action potentials occur across a big network of neurons, hundreds or thousands of neurons, is that coordinated activity of all of these neurons a physiological process that creates conscious awareness? We think that's true. But is it? We simply don't know that that's the case, right? And if it's true, why does that happen? Do we care why it happens if it does? Well, certainly we would think that in the end, if we wanted to explain all of this stuff, we would want to know, why is it that consciousness arises as a result of what neurons do and not as a result of what other cells in the body do? All of the cells in the body are similar in certain respects, right? They have a cell wall. They have a nucleus with DNA that instructs the cells to manufacture certain proteins, and those proteins do various things inside each particular cell. So is it the proteins of neurons that create consciousness, but the proteins in cardiac cells in the heart do not create consciousness, or cells in the liver, or cells in the pancreas? Those all work too, and they make proteins, but those particular proteins and cellular activity do not lead to consciousness, but there's something special about neurons that does. Well, why? What's the difference? What's that peculiar difference between neurons and pancreatic cells? One creates consciousness and the other does not. Assuming it's even true that neurons create consciousness. Some philosophers don't even like saying that. Some philosophers will say that it is, if you remember back in chapter 2, we talked about some of the rules of a good scientific theory, and one is that it should be simple or parsimonious. And some philosophers consider the idea that neurons and only neurons create consciousness, but other kinds of cells and other kinds of objects cannot create consciousness. So that requires a kind of assumption that there's two kinds of things in the world, right? The kind of thing that can create consciousness and the kind of thing that cannot create consciousness. So some philosophers prefer an argument where there's only one kind of thing. And you have a choice here, right? You have a choice to say that there's only one kind of thing, and that one kind of thing does not create consciousness. So that would seem to suggest a strange implication, right? It would suggest that consciousness does not exist, that it's an illusion. And there's a name for that. It's called, well, there's lots of names for it. You call it materialism, or you could call it more appropriately, it's called intentional eliminativism, right? So intentional eliminativism means that we are eliminating the idea that people have conscious intentions. But then there's a different idea. And this idea suggests that there's nothing special about neurons that create consciousness, because everything creates consciousness. Consciousness is a feature of the universe. It's not a peculiar characteristic of neurons, it's a universal feature of all things. And that sounds equally funky because there's a word for that too. It's called panpsychism, and it means that everything is conscious. That means that not only is your brain conscious, but it also means that maybe my coffee cup here that you can see in my video stream is conscious. Though it would be, obviously, we would think a very different kind of consciousness, it does raise the possibility that there's some sort of consciousness associated with all matter. That's probably about as philosophical as we want to get with this particular chapter. But we can try to make this a little bit more concrete. So in this part, what we want to try to do is we're going to say, okay, what is it that we think of as consciousness? Well, we think of consciousness as ideas, right? I have ideas about things. I have ideas about my coffee cup, right? And I have ideas about its shape. So I can describe it as being, well, the main part of it is round, or more technically cylindrical, as a three-dimensional object, right? I can experience that visually by looking at it, and I can experience it what's called haptically by touching it and wrapping my hands around it so that I get my grip to learn its shape that way. Likewise, I can also experience with my eyes, have ideas about its color, right? This kind of a darkish, brownish yellow color with black specks and the words, let's get it to you here, University of Penn, right across the front. I can also experience by touching it, not just its shape, but its texture. It's smooth and glassy. And it's a little cool to the touch because I've been sitting here with it for 30 minutes. And likewise, when I take a sip of the coffee, I have ideas about coffee, such as its taste. In this case, it's cold. And so it's a cold, bitter coffee. That's not all that nice, right? So that's what we have. We have ideas. And so we could call these internal stimuli because these are ideas in my mind about the color and the shape and the patterns of the cup that I can see. And I can also have ideas about the shape and texture and temperature of the cup that I can feel. And I can also have ideas about the taste and temperature of the coffee that I can drink. So we'll call that internal stimuli because these are ideas in my mind about the object. But we're also suggesting that there's some correspondence between these ideas and the actual thing, that there is a cup and it's round and it's made of ceramic and all of these things, so that it has there's a relationship here between internal things and external things, right? But one of the concerns, of course, is that with that whole question of qualia, that there's a lack of resemblance, right? So when we said, for example, when we were talking about color, so in this case, this object is this weird yellowish, brownish, tan color. That's a property of the idea, but it's not a property of the thing. Objects don't have color, light doesn't have color, but color only exists in the mind. So there's not a really obvious resemblance, right? Internal ideas may have some connection to external things, but they don't resemble those external things, right? Why is it that an object like the cup looks the color, or my shirt, blue, right? What makes it blue? What makes it appear blue, right? So rather than worry too much about the nature of qualia, right? Why is it that red appears red, and how is that neurons create the appearance of red and blue and so forth? Let's think more about how the brain works. So let me just tackle that word at the bottom of the screen before we move on, because we haven't really dealt with this word before, solipsism. It's easy to take some of this discussion of philosophy of mind and to get overly concerned with ideas in the mind and to start losing track of the world outside of us, right? We can just get lost in these ideas and start to think that, well, everything that I know about things is really just an experience. It's really just a qualia. When I describe the cup, I can describe it as being round and cool to the touch and glassy in its texture and yellowish tan in its color. But those are all descriptions of ideas in my mind, not necessarily of the cup itself. And once we start doing that, we start raising the issue of whether or not we know anything at all about a relationship or a connection between the ideas in the mind and an object. And the philosophy called solipsism is the idea is that the only thing that we actually know at all are just ideas in our minds. And whether there's even a reality out there at all is something that could be doubted, right? So if you've ever seen the Matrix movie, that's kind of a solipsistic idea, right? That suggests that there is no world out there, that what you experience with your senses is some sort of an elaborate deception or illusion, and it's not real. And that there's either no objective reality out there, or if there is, there's no way for you to possibly know anything about it. So we don't like that kind of stuff. So we're going to try to adopt a slightly different perspective. Now, I don't have this video here. Let's see if it's going to work. It might work. Okay, so that video is actually not going to work for our lecture recording, but this is a YouTube video, and I'll just link it so that you can watch it on your own. But it raises the question that to get us into the kind of further elaboration on the concept of what qualia means. And but the last thing I want to say about this, because I'm gonna stop the video here as well, is I'm going to divide this chapter into two videos to break it up, is that ultimately these questions remain a little too philosophical for our scientific interest. And what we're going to focus instead on is leaving the question, the so-called hard problem of consciousness, in the background while we try to focus on the easier questions. And the easier questions could be something like, what do the parts of the visual parts of the brain? So let's focus on this picture here that's showing the strawberry is either a red strawberry or a green strawberry, because that relates to the question of qualia, right? Why is it that the strawberry appears one way or the other? And even if we say that the redness is not a property of the strawberry itself inherently, or of the light coming into our eyes, nevertheless, there must be some systematic relationship here, right? And by systematic, I mean that there's some kind of process by which the strawberry and the surface of the strawberry absorbs some wavelengths of light and reflects other wavelengths of light. And that's a physical process that can be explainable with physical laws of theory, laws of optics, right, in physics. And further, that it can also, that light that reflects from the strawberry as it makes it into our eye triggers a pretty systematic and understandable pattern of neural activity in the brain. And that we can understand those processes, right? We can understand how objects reflect light. We can understand how light excites the eyes and how the signal from the eyes is then transmitted into the brain and what the brain does with that information. And we can trace that out into the point where we can understand that there are certain parts of the visual cortex and the occipital lobe of the brain that respond to the wavelength of light that ultimately lead to us saying that it looks red. And even though we can't account for the unique quality of redness as an experiential thing, we can still map out the relationship between the physical stimulus, the object and light, and the brain and its responses to that, right? And there's a fancy word for this. It's called psychophysics, right? Think about what that means. Psycho for the psychological part. It's not about physics going psycho, right? But that's kind of how I like to think of it sometimes. But the idea is that it's about taking the physical stuff, objects and light, and connecting it to psychological stuff, right? Mapping it out. Is there a relationship between light wavelength and colors? Yes, there is, right? And that's a relationship that can actually be scientifically studied. If I present light stimuli to people and I manipulate the wavelength of that light, are there corresponding systematic changes in their reported color that they see? Yes, there is. And therefore that becomes a scientific thing that is studyable, right? And what I'm doing is I'm mapping the relationship between the physical stimulus measurable in terms of light and its wavelengths to the psychological response, which is someone's reported color that they're seeing, right? That's what psychophysics is about, is mapping physical stimulation to psychological responding. We can do it with sound as well. I can manipulate sound waves and manipulate their frequency. And people can tell me about its pitch, right? That's a psychophysical relationship. Or I can manipulate the decibel level and then people will tell me something about the perceived loudness. That's also a psychophysical relationship, right? So these kinds of psychophysical questions are much more scientific, right? So we can abandon the funky weirdness of consciousness and qualia, and we can simplify it to psychophysics. But we're not going to get any more into psychophysics until the next chapter when we talk about sensation and perception in chapter 5, because that's where the question of psychophysics becomes much more directly relevant. The last half of this set of notes, we're going to be talking about states of consciousness and issues related to sleep, stages of sleep and things of that nature. So we're going to stop it here.